The man shook his head vehemently, stepping out onto the porch. "There's no one in the shed," he said firmly, his voice trembling slightly. "We don't use it anymore. It's been locked up for years." My stomach dropped. The voice on the phone had been so certain, so deliberate. "Are you sure?" I asked, glancing past him toward the yard. The shed was just barely visible under the moonlight, a shadowy structure half hidden by the tall grass and trees. Its crooked roof and boarded-up windows gave it an air of abandonment, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that someone or something might be inside. "Yes," the man insisted, his voice rising with a mixture of urgency and fear. "You shouldn't go back there." The children peeked out from behind their father, their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The woman's voice came from deeper inside the house, sharp and nervous. "Who's on the phone? What's going on?" I felt trapped. Every instinct told me to leave, to get in my car and drive as fast as I could back to the safety of the pizza shop. But the voice on the phone had sounded so real, so purposeful. I didn't want to believe it was a prank, but the alternative, the possibility that someone truly was in the shed, was even worse. "I think it's best if I just leave," I said, trying to mask the quaver in my voice. "I'll let my manager know there was a mistake." As I turned to walk back to my car, the phone buzzed again in my hand. The same number. I hesitated before answering, every fiber of my being screaming not to. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "You didn't bring it," the voice rasped, angrier now. "I told you to come to the shed." The line went dead. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the phone, my hands trembling. Without another word, I sprinted to my car, the gravel crunching loudly underfoot. The family stood frozen on the porch, watching me with expressions that mirrored my own fear. I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the car and sliding into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, I risked one last glance toward the shed. My heart nearly stopped. A figure stood in front of it. The silhouette was tall and motionless, barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. Its head was tilted slightly, as though watching me. The porch light behind the family flickered, casting an eerie glow over the yard, but the figure didn't move. I slammed the car into reverse, tearing out of the driveway and onto the main road. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel as I sped back toward town, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answered. Who or what had been in the shed? And why had they ordered a pizza to a house that hadn't placed an order? When I finally reached the shop, my manager was waiting for me, looking concerned. "What happened?" he asked as I stumbled inside, visibly shaken. I told him everything, from the strange phone call to the figure in the yard. He frowned, pulling up the order history on the computer. "That's weird," he muttered. "The number doesn't match any of our usual customers." And look, he turned the screen toward me. The order had been deleted. There was no record of the address, the phone number, or the pizza. "Are you sure you delivered it to the right place?" he asked, his tone skeptical but not accusatory. Yes, I snapped, the adrenaline still coursing through me. I was at 1489 Oak Ridge. The family there didn't order anything, and someone in the shed, claimed they did. My manager's expression darkened. Oak Ridge? He repeated slowly. You sure that's the address? I nodded, confused by the sudden change in his demeanor. He leaned back in his chair, his face pale. That house has been empty for years. No one lives there. My heart sank. That's not possible, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a family, a man, a woman, 2 kids. They spoke to me. They warned me about the shed. He shook his head. I don't know what to tell you. That place has been abandoned for at least a decade. People around here say it's haunted, but I always thought it was just stories. Haunted. The word hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. I wanted to argue, to explain what I had seen and heard, but the look in my manager's eyes told me he wouldn't believe me. And honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside my window sent me into a spiral of fear. I couldn't shake the image of the figure in the yard, standing so still, so silent. And the voice on the phone, how had it known I was there? Why had it chosen me? I quit the job a week later. The thought of going back out on those dark, lonely roads was too much to bear. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I've told the story to a few close friends, but most of them dismiss it as a prank or a figment of my imagination. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I'll never forget the feeling of standing on that porch, staring into the shadows, knowing that something out there was staring back. It started as an ordinary night. A few pizza deliveries, the faint hum of the car radio, and the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. But as I pulled up to the house, something about the scene felt off. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, the porch light flickered sporadically, and the house itself had an air of neglect. Still, a job was a job, and I grabbed the pizza box, making my way to the door. The man who answered looked weary, as though he hadn't had a good night's sleep in weeks. He glanced at the box and hesitated, his brow furrowing. "We didn't order any pizza," he said, his voice low and cautious. I frowned, double-checking the address. "This is 42 Maple Street, right?" "Yes, but we didn't call for a delivery." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered, thinking it might be the customer. "Leave the pizza by the shed," a voice said. It was cold and devoid of any emotion. Then the line went dead. A chill ran down my spine. "No one lives in that shed," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, someone's claiming to be there," I replied, feeling a knot of dread form in my stomach. The man's wife appeared at the door, alarmed by the tension in his voice. "We should call the police," she said urgently, but her husband shook his head. "Let's check it out first," he said, grabbing a flashlight from a nearby table. It's probably just some teenager playing a prank. Reluctantly, I followed him down the driveway toward the shed, the pizza box still in my hands. The gravel crunched beneath our feet, and the wind rustled the trees, creating an eerie symphony that heightened my unease. The shed came into view, a small, dilapidated structure with broken windows and a door hanging loosely on its hinges. The flashlight beam danced across the peeling wood, revealing crude carvings and scratches that looked disturbingly like words, though I couldn't make them out from a distance. The man stopped a few feet from the door, shining his light inside. "Hello?" he called out. No response. Summoning my courage, I stepped closer and peeked inside. The interior was filthy, with a tattered mattress on the floor, empty food wrappers scattered around, and a foul, musty smell that made me gag. On the walls, scratched in jagged letters, were phrases like, "I'm watching you," and "I'll never leave." Before I could fully process what I was seeing, my phone rang again. The same number. My hands trembled as I answered. "You should have left the pizza at the door," the voice said, calm and cold. Then the call ended. A sudden crash from the house shattered the tense silence. We spun around and sprinted back, adrenaline propelling us forward. The man's wife stood at the doorway, her face a mask of terror. "Someone's inside," she screamed. The man rushed past her, grabbing a knife from the kitchen. I hesitated at the door, torn between fear and the urge to help. Summoning my courage, I followed him into the house. The living room was in disarray, with furniture overturned and picture frames shattered on the floor. Standing in the middle of the chaos was a gaunt man with wild eyes and a sinister grin. He held a large knife and stared at us with a mix of rage and twisted glee. "I told you I'd always wait for you," he said, his voice dripping with malice. The man lunged at the intruder, and a violent struggle ensued. The intruder slashed wildly, grazing the homeowner's arm. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy lamp and swung it with all my strength, striking the intruder and knocking him to the ground. The knife clattered out of his hand as he fell unconscious. The police arrived minutes later, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. They quickly apprehended the intruder, who turned out to be the woman's ex-partner. He had been stalking her for months, unable to accept that she had moved on. As they led him away in handcuffs, he turned to her and said, "I'll never let you go." The aftermath of that night left me shaken to the core. Even as I returned to my job the next day, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. The sinister voice on the phone, the words scratched into the shed walls, the chaos inside the house, it all felt like something out of a nightmare. And yet, it had been terrifyingly real. I tried to make sense of it. Who had called me? The intruder had been inside the house at the time of the crash, so it couldn't have been him. Was someone else involved? The thought sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. A week later, I received another delivery order for the same neighborhood. My boss, unaware of what had happened, handed me the ticket without a second thought. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart racing. The address wasn't the same, but it was close enough to send a wave of dread washing over me. Reluctantly, I took the order and drove to the location, every nerve in my body on edge. The house was different, this time newer, well kept, with a manicured lawn and a warm glow emanating from the windows. I let out a small sigh of relief as I approached the door. A middle-aged woman answered, smiling kindly as she took the pizza and handed me a generous tip. For a moment, I felt a sense of normalcy return. But as I walked back to my car, I noticed something strange. Across the street, a figure stood in the shadows, barely visible, but unmistakably watching me. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, an ominous silhouette against the dim light of a street lamp. I climbed into my car and drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. The figure was gone, but the unease lingered. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment, double-checking them before finally crawling into bed. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I decided to do some digging. I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to this story, that I'd only scratched the surface of something far darker. I started with a shed, searching local news archives and community forums for any mention of it. What I found was chilling. The property had a history. Decades ago, it belonged to a reclusive man who was rumored to be involved in occult practices. Neighbors reported strange noises and flickering lights coming from the shed late at night. Then, one day, the man vanished without a trace. The house changed hands multiple times over the years, but the stories persisted. Tenants would leave abruptly, citing unexplained occurrences and a pervasive sense of unease. The shed in particular seemed to be at the center of it all. I reached out to the current homeowners, hoping to learn more. They were reluctant to talk at first, but eventually opened up. The woman admitted that she'd felt uneasy ever since moving in, as though she were being watched. Her husband dismissed it as paranoia, but after the events of that night, he wasn't so sure. "We're planning to move," she said. "We just can't stay here anymore." As I left their house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Something about the shed, the intruder, and the mysterious phone calls didn't add up. I had stumbled into something much bigger than a simple pizza delivery, and the deeper I dug, the more I realized I might never fully understand it. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The house was eventually sold, the shed torn down, and the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But for me, the memory lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn extraordinary, and how close we all are to the darkness that lies just beneath the surface of everyday life. To this day, I wonder who or what called me that night. And though I'll never know for sure, one thing is certain: I'll never deliver to that area again.